I have a memory of when I was 6 years old, of my mother coming up to me in the kitchen of the house where we lived at the time in Connecticut. And she said, "Would you like to be your brother's godfather?" Okay, I was 6 years old. I had not made my first communion, let alone been confirmed. And my parents, some of you have met them, who are otherwise rather traditionally minded and devout Catholics, had an unusual idea that Cardinal Burke would call extra-canonical. In other words, the Code of Canon Law does not provide for a sponsor, for a godparent, to not have made his communion, let alone be confirmed. So somehow, some priest somewhere, whose name is at this point known only to God, permitted this unusual arrangement. And in my almost 25 years of priesthood, when I've told this story, I've said, if you come to me and ask me if your 6-year-old son can be godfather to the new baby in the family, I'm going to say no. But somehow in God's providence, this occurred, and it has made for a very special bond that Chris and I enjoy. So I'm so Catholic mind and heart with you, and also so that he can cook 2 dinners for me. Last night we had a lovely halibut. Tonight will be a ribeye. But in the meantime, this, I think, of all the talks that I've heard my brother give, and I've heard many of them over the years, is his best. And I think you'll enjoy it a lot. Chris, check.
Thank you, my brother. So on the table there's a handout. There's the poem, which we'll come to, and then there's an outline of the talk that will help you follow along or give you hope the talk is coming to an end. What a great gift to be able to give this talk at this magnificent shrine. Some of you know why. In the year that is the 450th anniversary of the battle, right? So 1571 to 2021, right? And then we'll celebrate 500 years here soon, in 50 years from now. I'll be watching from some other location, I think. So if I asked you to tell me when the Norman invasion was, you would say 1066. But if I asked you, if I told you there was a Norman invasion that took place before 1066, at least half a century or more before, would you know what I was talking about? I'm talking about the Norman invasion of southern Italy and Sicily, without which event in history, the Crusades could not have taken place, because Sicily was an important point of supply embarkation for Crusaders sailing to the Holy Land, right? If you go to Sicily today, if you go to Palermo, you'll see outside the city on the mountain, the Monreale, the Royal Mountain, one of the most magnificent Norman churches in the world. So if I asked you to tell me what happened in 1492, you would tell me Christopher Columbus. Yeah, but what other important event happened in 1492? The great Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, defeated the forces of Islam at the Battle of Granada and completed the longest war in human history, the 7th century Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, and made Catholic Europe whole again. Right? If we were playing Jeopardy R.I.P. Alex Trebek, right? And the category were great sea battles of the 16th century. And the dates there up on the board were 1588 or 1571. Of those two dates, to an American audience, which is the more recognizable date? It's 1588, which is what? Defeat of the Spanish Armada. Yeah, the defeat of the Spanish Armada. But the battle that we're going to talk about tonight, 1571, the Battle of Lepanto, in terms of political and salvation history, actually is a more significant sea battle. Now, what's underway here? Well, Americans, because we live in a Protestant country, insofar as the United States is a Christian country, it's a Protestant country, we tend to get British Protestant history. So we know 1588, we don't know 1571. But the great news for Catholics is that there's a solution, and it's the liturgical calendar. The liturgical calendar is full of events in the history of our faith, so we can better tune our imaginations to our great Catholic history. And if your interests run to things martial in the way that mine do, there are events on the liturgical calendar celebrating military victories, right? So who's Polish here? It's okay. Yep, good. September 12th, Holy Name of Mary, 1683, Gates of Vienna. John Sobieski, the Winged Hussars, the most extraordinary cavalry charge in history, saving Vienna from siege there at the last moment. That event, September 12th, is marked on the universal calendar now, thanks to John Paul, Holy Name of Mary, right? Mary, Help of Christians. Salesians celebrate Mary, Help of Christians. That's May 24th. You can remember that because that's my dad's birthday. May 24th, Mary, Help of Christians celebrates Pius VII's return to Rome after the defeat of Napoleon, right? You know, Pius VII was held captive for months by Napoleon. They had a great conversation. No, Pius VII's Secretary of State, a man named Cardinal Consalve, had a great conversation with Napoleon. Napoleon told the cardinal, Your Eminence, I'm going to destroy the Catholic Church. And the cardinal said, Emperor, for 1,800 years, the clergy have been trying to destroy the Catholic Church. August 6th, Transfiguration was elevated to the universal calendar by Pope Calixtus III after another battle against Islam. 1453, the walls of Belgrade, the greatest military trio ever assembled. John Capistrano, John Hunyadi, the great Hungarian general, and Count Dracula, Vlad Dracul, right there, joining their armies on the walls of Belgrade to repel the Turk. When the news got back to Rome, it was August 6th. Calixtus elevates the Feast of Transfiguration, which was not universally celebrated in the West, to the universal calendar. And then, of course, September 29th, the greatest military victory of all time, St. Michael the Archangel. But today we're going to talk about October 7th. Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, right? Originally Feast of Our Lady of Victory, Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. Note that 3 of these feasts that I've mentioned to you are Marian feasts, calling to mind this line from the Psalms, who is she that cometh forth as the morning rising, fair as the moon, bright as the sun, terrible as an army set in array. It's Our Lady who wins this victory for us, but we're getting a little bit ahead. Let's go October 1564. Suleiman the Magnificent assembles the viziers of the Divan of the Ottoman Empire, the Divan, like his cabinet, right? And they urge their sultan to prepare for war. Many more difficult victories have fallen to your scimitar than the capture of a handful of men on a tiny little island is not well fortified, they told him. Though flattery, their words were true. During his 5-decade reign, Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire under his rule grew to its glory, encompassing the Caucasus, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Middle East, North Africa. Suleiman had conquered Aden, Algiers, Baghdad, Belgrade, Budapest, Rhodes, Temesvar. His war galleys terrorized the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and worst of all, the Mediterranean Sea, where the Sultan's vast navy raided with impunity both coasts of Italy, carrying off young Italian Christian boys and girls to the slave markets in Constantinople and condemning Christian men to lives chained to a Turkish galley oar. Now, the tiny little island that the Sultan's advisors wanted him to invest was called, anybody? Malta. And located anywhere other than where God put it, this island would have remained unknown to history. It's an unfertile, dusty rock with so few natural springs that at this moment in history, the Maltese collected their drinking water in large clay urns when it rained. The island could sustain only the smallest population, but in the 16th century, the Malta guarded the sea passage in the Mediterranean world between the Islamic East and the Christian West. And from its magnificent natural harbor, the galleys of the Knights of St. John could sail forth and disrupt the logistic lines of any Turkish assault on Italy. And they could also practice, if you will, a kind of Christian piracy, boarding and seizing the periodic Turkish merchantmen carrying goods from France or Venice to be hawked in the markets of Constantinople. And the matrons of Suleiman's harem nagged the emperor for this particular reason, because these women often made vast fortunes speculating in French and Venetian luxuries. And what is the great Venetian luxury of this age and, just a little bit before? Glass, right? And what glass invention do we attribute to the Suleiman, however, was a strategic thinker. He had a bigger goal than pleasing a palace full of harem girls. He knew that if the harbors of Malta were in Turkish possession, he would have a forward base without equal to continue his raids on the coast of Italy. With the greater control of the Mediterranean that Malta, ownership of Malta would afford him, he could at last bring Venice to heel. The two great sea powers vying for control of the Mediterranean at this moment in history are Venice and the port, Constantinople. An invasion of Sicily would not be out of the question, nor would aid to the Moriscos. Who were the Moriscos? They were Moorish converts who really never converted, and now were about to be in full-scale rebellion against the King of Spain, Philip II. But Suleiman's dream, the dream of all the Turks, was the conquest of Rome, the red apple, they called it. There, the Turks could transform Michelangelo's basilica, still under construction, into a mosque, just as they had done 100 years before in Constantinople to the Hagia Sophia. Malta was a stepping stone to Rome. Now, the Sultan had led his army on no fewer than 12 major campaigns, but his age this time would keep him home. The Turks sailed for Malta the following spring, and on May 18, 1565, you can remember that because that's my wedding anniversary. Not 1565, yeah. 30 years this year. Their fleet was spotted offshore. Jean de la Valette, the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, led his warriors into their chapel where they confessed and assisted at the holy sacrifice of the Mass. A formidable army composed of audacious barbarians is descending on this island, he told them. These persons, my brothers, are the enemies of Jesus Christ. Today it is a question of the defense of our faith. Are the Gospels to be superseded by the Quran? God on this occasion demands of us our lives, already vowed to his service. Happy will be those who first consummate this sacrifice. Now, many of Valette's 700 knights and their men-at-arms did consummate that sacrifice. But while all of Europe stood idly by, expecting the fortress island to fall against an Ottoman army of 40,000, including 6,500 of the elite janissaries, 3/4 of the Turkish army were killed over the 4-month siege. And as the Ottoman survivors straggled back to Constantinople, a sense began to spread throughout Europe that the Sultan was not so invincible after all. The sense back in Constantinople was rage. That my sword is invincible, exploded the Sultan. And by May of the following year, he was leading his army of 300,000 men across the plains of Hungary, bound for Vienna. And when the Hungarian Count of Szigetvar, a fortress city on the eastern frontier of the Holy Roman Empire, led a successful raid on the Ottoman supply trains, Suleiman wheeled his massive army around and swore to wipe Szigetvar off the map. Turkish engineers built bridges across the Drava and the Danube rivers to lay siege to Szigetvar. To greet the Sultan and to inspire his men, who were outnumbered 50-1, Count Miklos Zrinyi raised a large crucifix over his battlements and he fired his cannons in defiance. Both armies' thoughts turned to the previous year's contest on Malta, though Zrinyi knew that with a Hungary infested with Protestantism, hope of relief was even more faint than that entertained by the knights the previous year. For nearly a month, wave after wave of Turkish infantry were thrown back from the walls. Suleiman offered Zrinyi rule of all of Croatia if he would just yield his city. But the Count had his soul set on a higher sort of glory. No one shall point his finger at my children in contempt, he said. When the breaches made by Turkish artillery were too large to defend, the Catholic Count assembled his last 600 men. With this sword, he shouted, holding the bejeweled weapon aloft, I earned my first honor and glory. I want to appear with it once more before the eternal throne to hear my judgment. Charging out from the remains of their stronghold, the courageous band was swallowed by a sea of Turks. To the last man, the Hungarian knights died defending the Christian West. The Turks, furious at their losses, consoled themselves according to their grisly custom. They slaughtered every Christian civilian who had survived the siege. Suleiman the Magnificent did not witness the massacre, for he had died 4 days prior. Had he survived, however, to see this Ottoman victory on the remote Hungarian frontier, it would have given him no comfort. The capture of Szigetvar was altogether Pyrrhic. The Ottoman army had exhausted itself in the siege and was in no condition to carry on the campaign. Though all dead, Count Zrinyi and his heroic band were the true victors. Back in Constantinople, Suleiman's son ascended the throne by the usual Ottoman method, a complex harem intrigue designed to kill off all of his worthier brothers. Unlike every previous sultan, Selim II, nicknamed the Sot, which means what? The drunk, had little interest in warfare. His enthusiasm for wine, his extraordinary and extraordinarily deviant appetites, wine, poetry, though he was a lesser poet than his father, and wine. Nonetheless, he sensed that without a decisive victory, the mighty empire his father had left him would face eclipse. He decided to invade the Venetian-held Cyprus, where half the population, Greek serfs laboring under the exacting rule of their Venetian masters, would offer little resistance to an Ottoman takeover. Further, goes the story, Cyprus was the site of his favorite vintage. The Turks rolled through Cyprus. After a 46-day siege, the capital city of Nicosia fell on September 9, 1570. The 500 Venetians of the garrison surrendered on terms, but once the city gates were opened, the Turks rushed in and slaughtered them all. Then the Turks set on the civilian population. 20,000 were massacred, some in such bizarre ways that those merely put to the sword were lucky. Every house was plundered. Mothers, to protect their daughters from assault, stabbed them and then themselves, or threw themselves from the rooftops. 2,000 of the prettier boys and girls were gathered and shipped off as provender for the slave markets in Constantinople. Soon the news reached Western Europe that only the port city of Famagusta on the eastern coast of the island held out. Spain and the Italian republics began to realize that only a united front would be sufficient to stop the continued assaults of the Ottoman Empire. Now, had the matter of such an alliance been left to the rulers of these various states, St. Peter's Basilica may well have become a mosque. But God intervened and sent one of history's greatest popes, Pio Quinto. Pope St. Pius V, who declared, "I am taking up arms against the Turk, and the only thing that can help me are the prayers of priests of pure life." An aged Dominican priest, Michael Ghislieri, when he ascended the chair of Peter, faced two foes: Protestantism and Islam. He was up to the task. He had served as Grand Inquisitor, and the austerity of his private mortifications contrasted starkly with the lifestyles of his Renaissance forebears. During his 6-year reign, he promulgated the Council of Trent, published the works of Thomas Aquinas, issued the Roman Catechism, issued a new missal, the very missal today that's used at the extraordinary form, issued a new breviary, created 21 cardinals, excommunicated Queen Elizabeth, and led, aided by St. Charles Borromeo, a reform of the clergy and the episcopacy that had grown soft and degenerate. In a papacy of great achievements, the greatest came on March 7, 1571, the feast of his fellow Dominican, in the old calendar, St. Thomas Aquinas. At the Dominican Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, anybody been there? St. Catherine of Siena is buried under the high altar. Pope Pius V formed the Holy League. Genoa, the Papal States, Spain, put aside their jealousies and pledged to assemble a fleet capable of confronting the Sultan's war galleys before the east coast of Italy became the next front line in the battle between Christianity and Islam. The day was not a total triumph. Venice refused to join. Though at open war with the Turks over Cyprus, the Venetians never failed to consider their economy. They might well lose Cyprus, but a fast peace with Constantinople afterwards would resume normal trade relations with the Turks. Moreover, the loss of the Venetian fleet in an all-out battle with the Sultan's galleys would be a disaster for a state so dependent on seaborne commerce. From the Pope's perspective, however, the Venetians had traded their birthright as Christians for a mess of pottage. Walking back across the Tiber, the old friar wept for the future of Christendom, for he knew that without the war galleys of Venice, there was no hope of mounting a fleet sufficient to face the Turk. The rest of Europe ignored Pius's call for a new crusade. The bastard Queen of England, Elizabeth I, was in open rebellion at Rome, too busy putting to sword and stake English defenders of the Holy Mass and confiscating Holy Mother Church's monasteries to be of any help. Pius wrote a personal letter to Charles IX, the Valois King of France, asking his kingdom's aid. But Charles's mother, history's real-life Lady Macbeth, Catherine de' Medici, was calling all the shots in France. Charles wrote back, no. France, in fact, had openly traded with the Turks for years, and as recently as 1569, so just 2 years before, drawn up an extensive commercial treaty with the Ottomans, powered by a powerful Jewish banker named Joseph Mikas. For years, the French had allowed Turkish ships to harbor in Toulon, and the oars that rowed Turkish galleys were manufactured in Marseille. Further, with Venice at war with Constantinople, markets that were once filled by Venetian goods were now open to France. Redeeming France from utter disgrace, the Knights of St. John of Malta, ever eager to do battle with the Turks, who sent their galleys to join the Holy League. As the Pope prayed for Venice to answer her higher call, a new breed of fiery priests, led by such stirring preachers as San Francisco Borgia, Superior General of the Jesuits, inspired the hearts of Christian Europeans throughout the Mediterranean with their sermons against Islam. Enough Venetians must have been listening. And on May 25th, Venice at last joined the Holy League. Not only did the struggle for Cyprus continue, but African corsairs in the service of the Sultan were raiding off of the Venetian coast within cannon range of Basilica San Marco. An explosion and fire in the famous Venetian arsenal that to this day goes unsolved further focused Venetian priorities. By fits and starts, and not without hesitation and quarreling on the part of a few of the principal players, the fleet of the Holy League was forming. Now, the man in whom there was not a shred of hesitation was the one chosen by Pius V as Captain General of the Holy League, Don John of Austria, the illegitimate son of the late Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and half-brother to King Philip II, King of Spain. This young commander had distinguished himself in combat against the Barbary corsairs and in the Morisco Rebellion, a campaign in which he demonstrated his capacity for swift violence when the threat called for it, but also restraint when charity demanded it. He was a great horseman, a great swordsman, and a great dancer. With charm and wit and good looks in abundance, he was, to say the least, quite popular with the ladies at court. Since childhood, he had cultivated a deep devotion to the Blessed Virgin. He spoke Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish. He kept a pet marmoset and a pet lion cub that slept at the foot of his bed. He was 24 years old. Taking the young warrior by his shoulders, Pius V looked at Don John of Austria and said, "The Turks, swollen by their victories, will wish to take on our fleet, and God, I have the pious presentiment, will grant us victory. Charles V gave you life. I will give you honor and greatness. Go and seek them out." As Don John was making his way in late summer of 1571 to the harbor in Messina to take command of his fleet, the situation on Cyprus grew more desperate. The Venetian colonists had claimed the lives of some 50,000 Turks with their intrepid defense of Famagusta. But when all their supplies and gunpowder were exhausted, and when they had eaten their last horse, their shrewd governor, a man named Marcantonio Bragadino, sent a message to the Turkish commander, a man named Lala Mustafa, asking for terms. The Turks agreed to give the remaining Venetian soldiers passage to Crete on 14 Turkish galleys in exchange for surrender of the city. The Greek Cypriots could retain their private property and continue to practice their religion. August 4th, 1571, Marcantonio Bragadino, with a small entourage, including several young boys acting as pages, met with Lala Mustafa and his advisors in the Turkish commander's tent. Mustafa demanded a boy named Antonio Querini, Marcantonio Bragadino's page, as hostage for the 14 galleys. When Bragadino calmly refused, he and his men were pushed out of the Turkish commander's tent. Bragadino was bound and forced to watch as his attendants were cut to pieces. The boys were let off in chains. 3 times, the Turks took Bragadino's head and put it on the chopping block, 3 times lifting it to test his resolve. Instead of cutting off his head, they cut off his nose, and then they cut off his ears. So that he didn't bleed to death, they cauterized the wounds with a hot iron. The Venetian soldiers of the garrison, unaware that Mustafa had broken the terms, begin their march down to the galleys, expecting passage to Crete. Once aboard, the Venetians are set upon by Turkish soldiers who strip them of their clothes and chain them to the oars. And from their benches, they now witness the ordeal to which the Turks subject their governor. First, the Turks fit Bragadino with a harness and a bridle, and they lead him around the Turkish camp on his hands and knees with ass panniers filled with dung slung over his back. Each time he passed Lala Mustafa's tent, his head was forced to kiss the ground. Next, he was strung up in chains, hoisted over a galley spar, and left to hang for hours in the hot August sun. Finally, the courageous governor was dragged to the city center. He was lashed to the pillory, and he was flayed alive. Witnesses said they heard him whispering a Latin prayer. He died when the executioner's knife reached the height of his navel. The diabolical orgy did not end there. Lala Mustafa had the governor's skin stuffed. He hoisted it up the mast of his galley and joined the Ottoman fleet headed west. As Marcantonio Bragadino was losing his life to Turkish monsters, Don John was inspecting his ships. Of the 206 smaller boats that comprise the Holy League, half came from Venice. The next biggest contingent came from Spain. These included galleys from the Kingdom of Sicily, Naples, Portugal, and Genoa. The galleys that were owned by Genoa were in fact owned by a Genovese condottiere, a soldier of fortune, named Gianandrea Doria. Doria was renting his services to the King of Spain at cost about 30% higher than what Philip was paying to operate his own galleys. And the Genovese, of course, were great bankers, and he was lending Philip the money at 14% interest. The balance of the galleys came from the Holy See. When Don John took charge of his galleys, he forbade women from coming aboard. He declared that blasphemy among the crews would be punishable by death. The whole fleet followed his example, and they made a 3-day fast. Though he had not yet learned of the fate of Famagusta, Don John knew that the Ottoman fleet was sailing west. He could only guess, he would have been right, that the young Ottoman admiral, a man named Muzanzade, so son of a Muzanzade Ali Pasha, had explicit orders from Selim II to engage the Christians in a pitched battle. After a sortie as far north as the Gulf of Preveza, the Ottoman fleet, comprising some 230 galleys and some 70 smaller craft, including the swift, shallow draft galleots of the African corsairs, harbored in the Bay of Lepanto on the north side of the Gulf of Patras. By September 28th, the Holy League had made its way across the Adriatic Sea and was anchored between the west coast of Greece and the island of Corfu. By this time, the news of Bragadino's death had reached the fleet, and the Venetians especially were ready to settle the score. Don John reminded all of his fleet that the battle that they would soon face was as much spiritual as it was physical. Pius V had granted a plenary indulgence to the soldiers and crews of the Holy League. Priests of the great orders, Franciscans, Capuchins, Dominicans, Theatines, Jesuits, were stationed on the decks of the Holy League's galleys, offering mass, hearing confessions. Many of the men who rowed the Christian galleys were criminals, thieves, debtors, or men who maybe had, killed their wives' lover. Don John ordered them all enchained, and he issued them a weapon, promising them their freedom if they fought bravely. He then issued to every man in the Holy League a weapon more powerful than anything in the Turkish arsenal, a rosary. On the eve of the battle, the men of the Holy League prepared their souls by falling to their knees on the decks of their galleys and praying a rosary. Back in Rome and up and down the Italian peninsula at the behest of Pius V, the churches were packed with the faithful telling their beads. In heaven, the Blessed Mother, her immaculate heart aflame, was listening. In the quiet of the night, Don John met with his admirals on the deck of his flagship Real to review once more the order for battle. He had divided his fleet into 4 squadrons of some 50 to 60 galleys each. Commanding the squadron on his left flank, the northernmost flank, was a Venetian warrior named Agustin Barbarigo. The center squadron was commanded by Don John himself, and he was assisted on either side by his vice admirals, the Roman Marcantonio Colonna and the Venetian Sebastian Veniero. Directly behind the center squadron, Don John stationed in the reserve the Spaniard, Don Alvaro de Bazan, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, Spain's greatest naval captain. The right squadron was under the command of the Genovese, banker, warrior, Gianandrea Doria. Arrayed for battle, the mighty armada of the Holy League looked like nothing if not a Latin cross. Now, Gianandrea Doria, as we might suspect, apart from his mercenary motives, had been the source of some good tactical counsel. He told Don John of Austria, cut the spars off of the front of each galley. This will allow the centerline bow cannon to depress further, firing their rounds at the waterline at the enemy hull. Galleys had been equipped with spars going all the way back to Salamis, right? With a Greek galley in the 5th century BC, that spar would be at the waterline. This is before the age of gunpowder, right? And the object there in ancient Greece and Rome would be, a perpendicular strike like this to ram a hole in that enemy galley and then back up and then leave that ship to founder, right? Now, you can see a 16th century war galley is out a little bit differently, but that rig, that outrigger device called the telaro, which supports the weight of the oars there, that is actually above the deck, all right? Here, you want to use your spar in a collision, kind of more at an angular, a glancing blow to disable that telaro so that the ship cannot maneuver. But this moment in history where Gianandrea Doria says, cut the spars off so we can use the cannons more effectively, this is a signal moment in the age of gunpowder. Doria also advised taking the League's 6 galleasses and stationing them in the van, 2 before each of the 3 forward squadrons. A galleass was a Venetian merchant vessel. It was not a warship, but for this battle was outfitted not only with cannons at the bow and the stern, but and a typical galley would not have cannons on the side, this on the port and starboard side as well. Where an ordinary galley would be most vulnerable, these galleasses packed heavy firepower. And Don John increased the lethality of the galleasses by packing the decks with Spanish arquebusiers. What's an arquebus? It's a very early handheld gun. Their defect is that they're very slow moving because they're 1.5 times the size of an ordinary galley. So they had to be towed into place at the van in front of each of the 3 forward squadrons. But they provide a powerful shock at the start of the battle. Now, Gianandrea Doria was an admiral, but he was also a ship owner. He looked at Don John. He raises his palm. He lifts his eyebrows and says, "There is still time, Your Grace, to avoid a pitched battle." The young Captain General stood surrounded by men older and with greater military and seafaring experience than he. Indeed, Sebastian Vignero was 3 times his age, 76 years old. Silence filled the small stateroom as these men waited to hear Don John's response. He caught their eyes, each one of them, as he looked around. "Gentlemen," he said, "the time for counsel has passed. Now is the time for war." It was. In the dawn's mist of October 7, 1571, the Holy League rode down the west coast of Greece and turned east into the Gulf of Patras. When the morning mist cleared, the Christians, rowing directly against the wind, saw the squadrons of the larger Ottoman fleet arrayed like a crescent and stretched from shore to shore, bearing down on them under full sail. As the fleets grew closer, the Christians could hear the gongs and the cymbals and the cries of the Turks. The men of the Holy League silently pulled at their oars. The soldiers stood on the decks in silent prayer. Priests marched up and down the decks holding large crucifixes aloft, exhorting the men to be brave, hearing final confessions. And then the Blessed Virgin intervened. The wind shifted 180 degrees. The Ottomans struck their sails, and tens of thousands of Christian galley slaves who rowed the Turkish boats were whipped up from under their benches. The sails of the Holy League were filled with the divine breath, driving them into battle. Don John knelt for a final prayer on the prow of Real. He stood up and he gave the order for the Holy League's battle standard, a gift from Pius V to be unfurled. Christians up and down the battle line watched as the giant blue banner bearing an image of our Lord crucified strained in the wind. They let forth a cry of cheer, of confidence in their young commander and hope in their God. At midday, the fleets closed and engaged. The first fighting began along the Holy League's left flank, where many of the smaller, swiftish Turkish galleys were able to maneuver around Agustin Barbarigo's inshore flank. The Venetian admiral responded with a near impossibility. He pivoted his entire squadron, 54 ships counterclockwise, and began to pin the Turkish right flank, commanded by Mehmet Shirako, against the northern shore of the Gulf of Patras. Gaps formed in Barbarigo's line. Ottoman galleys broke into the intervals. As galley pulled up along galley, the slaughter brought on by cannon, musket ball, and arrow was horrific. But in time, the Venetians prevailed. Barbarigo took an arrow to the eye. Before he died, he learned of the capture of Shirako and the crushing defeat of the Turkish right line. In the center of the action, breaking the convention of naval warfare, the opposing flagships engaged. Don John's Real with Muzanzade Ali Pasha's Sultana. Twice, Spanish infantry, the world's finest, boarded and drove the Sultan's janissaries back to the mast. And twice they were driven back to Real by Ottoman reinforcements. Don John led the third charge across Sultana's bloodied deck. He was wounded in the leg, but Ali Pasha took a musket ball to the forehead. One of Real's freed convicts lopped off the Turkish admiral's head, held it aloft on a pike. The Muslims' sacred banner, which had the name of Allah stitched in gold calligraphy 28,900 times, which Islamic tradition held had been carried in battle before the Prophet himself, was captured by the Christians. Terror struck the Turks, and the slaughter began. Bodies and limbs quivered on the scarlet deck. The sea ran red, but the fight was far from won. On the Holy League's right flank, Gian Andrea Doria was forced to increase the intervals between his galleys to keep his line abreast from being flanked on the south by the larger Ottoman squadron under the command of the Algerian Ulik Ali. When the space between Doria's squadron and Don John's grew large enough, Ulik Ali sent his corsairs through the gap to envelop from behind the galleys of Don John's squadron. Don Alvaro de Bazan, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, Spain's greatest naval captain, commanding the Holy League's reserve, had carefully kept his ships out of the fray, reading the battle, waiting for the moment when he was most required. Now he entered the fight, rescuing the center of the Holy League from the Turkish vessels that had surrounded them before turning his squadron south to aid the outmanned Doria. The fighting lasted for 5 hours. The sides were evenly matched and well led, but the divine favored the Christians, and once the battle turned in their favor, it became a total rout. All but 13 of the Turkish galleys were captured or sunk, and over 30,000 Turks were slain. It would not be until the First World War that the world would witness so many casualties in a single day's fighting. In the aftermath of the battle, the Christians gave no quarter, being sure especially to kill the helmsmen, the galley captains, the janissaries, the archers. The Sultan could rebuild ships, but a galley is a difficult ship to operate, and without the experts, he would not be able to put them to sea. The news of the victory made its way back to Rome, but the Pope was already rejoicing. On the day of the battle, Pius V had been consulting with his cardinals at the Dominican Basilica of Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill. He paused in the midst of their deliberations to look out the window where the Blessed Virgin favored him with a vision of the victory. Turning to his cardinals, he said, "Let us set aside business and fall on our knees in thanksgiving to God who has given our fleet a great victory." The stories of that glorious day would fill a book. A young contemporary of Don John's, Miguel Cervantes, fought with abandon. He lost much of his left hand to a Turkish musket ball. He kept all of his right to one day pen Spain's greatest novel, Don Quixote. At one point in the battle, Don John's marmoset was seen picking up and throwing overboard Turkish grenades before they could explode. On another galley, a soldier of the Holy League, his soul torn with despair, took his sword to the ship's crucifix, but the blade instantly shattered. Many years later, an attempt to reforge the weapon was made, but the moment the new blade was pulled from the fire, it immediately fell to pieces. The crucifix on board Don John's galley, the corpus on the crucifix on board Don John's galley, twisted itself to dodge a Turkish cannonball. You can see it in a side chapel, the first side chapel on the right, when you go into the cathedral, the old cathedral in Barcelona. Of interest to American Catholics is an image displayed in the Doria family church in a small town, San Stefano, up in the mountains north of Genoa. Gian Andrea Doria carried this gift from the King of Spain on his galley exactly 40 years before the Battle of Lepanto. The Blessed Virgin appeared to a peasant leaving a miraculous image of herself on his smock. The bishop of the region commissioned a local artist to paint 5 copies, and he touched each one to the original. Our Lady of Guadalupe was at Lepanto. Thank you. So, we have time, Steve? Okay. So this is a moment, of course, in political history, but it's a moment also in salvation history. And in that regard, it enters where? Into the realm of mystery. And mysteries are something that we engage not so much with our intellect, but with our heart. And the action of the heart is love. And to help us fall in love with this story, our friend G.K. Chesterton has left us this magnificent ballad. Now, I should tell you, Thomas Aquinas, that great and rigorous philosopher, says that it's poetry that we turn to when the thing under consideration does not find sufficient expression in rhetoric or prose. And so that is why when we're dealing with a mystery, it is good to have a nice account of the events, but it's better to have this poem. G.K. Chesterton wrote the poem in 1910 before he became a Catholic, but you can see from the poem that he was well on his way. The poem was instantly popular. G.K. Chesterton wrote the poem while the mailman was waiting for the copy because it had to be published in Belloc's, his friend Hilaire Belloc's, weekly newspaper. So the mailman's waiting impatiently for the copy, and Chesterton, kind of like a Mozart, he just first draft, and he wrote the poem. The poem was popular for years. Chesterton got a letter in 1914 from John Buchan. John Buchan, who went on to write the 39 Steps, right? And all those wonderful mysteries, was a war correspondent in the trenches in France. He wrote a letter to G.K. Chesterton in 1914. He said, "We shouted your Lepanto to one another in the trenches today." And you can see how a poem would inspire men feeling like they are in a contest, again, for the soul of the Christian West. The poem has enough alliteration in it to send a fifth grade English teacher, into ecstasy. It begins with the Sultan, white founts falling in the courts of the sun. It begins with the Sultan, and he's watching the fountains in Constantinople, and he's smiling. He's got this grin, this wicked grin on his face, and he's delighted because his war galleys are terrorizing, as Chesterton says, the inmost sea of all the earth, right? The Mediterranean, right? The sea in the middle of the earth, right? And the Pope, is unable to get any support, right? The cold Queen of England is looking in the glass. Who's that? Elizabeth I, right? The shadow of the Valois, Charles IX, King of France, is yawning at the Mass, right? And he says, and from evening isles fantastical ring faint the Spanish gun. Which way is evening? Which way is evening? West, right? So what is this a reference to? Where is Spain preoccupied with right now? Her discoveries in the New World, the West Indies. And meantime, the Sultan is laughing. But we hear these very dim drums, this crusade coming up out of the hills, where only on a nameless throne a crownless prince has stirred, right? Because Don John is not legitimate, right? So a nameless throne, a crownless prince, a half-attainted stall. A stall, of course, would be that seat where nobility would sit, right, at the Mass. But half-attainted, Chesterton has a play here on attained and tainted because of Don John's illegitimacy. His mother was Barbara Blumberg, a dancer. The last knight of Europe takes weapons from the wall. The last and lingering troubadour, a reference to St. Francis, right? To whom the bird is sung. And then the poem positively starts to march. And if you've ever served in the armed forces, you can feel it marching in your heart. The kettle drums, the torchlight crimson, the trumpets, the cannons. And Don John is laughing in his stirrups as he leads his force. And then the scene switches to Muhammad. Mahound is in his paradise above the evening star. And here is where Chesterton makes it extremely clear that the battle we're in now is a spiritual battle. And we're going to get an update, a parenthetical update on Don John's progress now as we go through each of these scenes. Mahound is in his paradise above the evening star. Don John of Austria is going to the war. And Mahound has his head on the lap of the Houri, right? The love nymph, okay? And he hears these drums and he hears this noise and he's not happy. He's in his paradise, but he is unhappy. He is unhappy. And he calls up from the deep all of these monsters from Islamic and Greek and Jewish mythology. And we get this line, multiplex of wing and eye, an apocalyptic reference, right? When strong obedience broke the sky when Solomon was king. And they come from the temples where the yellow gods shut up their eyes in scorn. And Chesterton is giving us a contrast here between the Oriental gods whose eyes are shut because why? They're contemplating themselves, and the God on the crucifix looking with his eyes open with love down on us, not with his eyes shut. Not with his eyes shut. What a contrast. Chase the jeers flying night and day, not giving rest. For that which was our trouble comes again out of the west. I've heard this noise before. It's Richard, it's Raymond, it's Godfrey. Who are they? The early crusaders, right? The early crusaders. And then he gives this wonderful compliment from the mouth of the enemy, this compliment to the Christian soldier. It is he that saith not kismet. It is he that knows not fate. It is Richard, it is Raymond, it is Godfrey at the gate. It is he whose loss is laughter when he counts the wager worth. So when the cause is right, the Christian soldier goes to his death with joy, with battle joy. There's a moment right before Don John's flagship collides with the Sultana, where Don John, Europe's greatest dancer, is there on the prow of his galley, and he breaks into a galliard, which is a very kind of really very romantic 16th century dance. What is this? This young Captain General is consumed with battle joy. And he says, the Mahound says, put down your feet upon him, that our peace be on the earth. And of course it isn't peace, right? It's tyranny. And then the scene switches to St. Michael on his mountain. Where is St. Michael's mountain? In France, right? Normandy, Mont Saint-Michel, Mount St. Michael, right? And Chesterton gives us a great image of Mont Saint-Michel. If you've ever been there, you know the tides there are do shift significantly, such that if your car is parked on that causeway, it will be covered in water if you don't get it off under certain circumstances, right? But he also says that St. Michael calls out and he makes this clarion call, but the noise goes through Normandy. The noise goes alone. The north is full of tangled things and texts and aching eyes, right? The north of Europe is consumed with Protestantism, with the pamphleteering, with the emphasis on sola scriptura. It's in the text. Christian killeth Christian in a narrow, dusty room. Christian dreadeth Christ with a newer face of doom, right? The God of Calvin who creates people just to damn them. And here, Chesterton, this beautiful reference to Our Lady who saves the day. Christian hateth Mary that God kissed in Galilee. John of Austria is writing to the scene. And then the scene switches to King Philip II of Spain. Now I have to say to you that Chesterton was an Englishman. King Philip was the man who sent an armada against his country. And so he's indulging here in a little bit of black legend. King Philip was one of the great monarchs of history, great Christian monarchs of history, but he puts him in his closet there, and he has the little dwarves that you see in the paintings of the Spanish royalty coming in and out of the closet, and he's got the Habsburg fleece around his neck. And it is true that Philip did run affairs from his office there in the Escorial. It's quite extraordinary that he was able to do this. But nonetheless, it's not a flattering portrayal. And he's holding some kind of bottle of poison. There was a rumor that Philip II killed his brother out of jealousy after the battle, after he'd gone to the Spanish Netherlands. It's not true. Don John died of an infection. But nonetheless, we have this somewhat unfair, but nevertheless poetic portrayal of Philip II. And then in contrast, the Pope. And the Pope is not in his closet, but he is in his chapel. And he's there. Don John of Austria is hidden in the smoke. The hidden room in man's house where God sits all the year. What is that room called? The tabernacle. And Chesterton gives us this magnificent image. The secret window whence the world looks small and very dear. So we look at that tabernacle, it's about this big. It seems very small to us, right? But actually, it contains infiniteness. And the view from the tabernacle is the world is really a small and very dear place. And the Pope sees this vision of the Islamic ships prevailing. They veil the plumed lions on the galleys of St. Mark, the galleys of Venice, right? Patron of St. Mark. And above the ships are palaces of brown, black painted chiefs, and below the ships are prisons. The galley slaves, the Christian galley slaves, and they are consumed with despair. And they find their God forgotten, and they seek no more a sign. And it's at that moment that Don John of Austria bursts the battle line, and then there's fighting and limbs being cut off and crimson running over all the decks. And then liberty, true liberty for the Christian galley slaves. Don John of Austria set his people free. And then the final image, Cervantes on his galley, putting the sword back in the sheath. And already he's having this very romantic idea of this great novel that he's going to write. And he ends this way. He smiles, but not as sultans smile. Right? It's not the maniacal smile, it's the smile of the Christian soldier who knows this is not the last battle, but we engage all of them with battle joy. We have time, Steve? Put your poems away, because if I make a mistake, I don't want you to know. White founts falling in the courts of the sun, and the soldier of Byzantium is smiling as they run. There is laughter like the fountains in that face of all men fear. It stirs the forest darkness, the darkness of his beard. It curls the blood-red crescent, the crescent of his lips. For the inmost sea of all the earth is shaken with his ships. They have dared the white republics up the capes of Italy. They have dashed the Adriatic round the line of the sea. And the Pope has cast his arms abroad for agony and loss and called the kings of Christendom for swords about the cross. The cold Queen of England is looking in the glass. The shadow of the Valois is yawning at the mass. From evening isles, fantastical rings faint the Spanish gun, and the Lord upon the golden horn is laughing in the sun. Dim drums throbbing in the hills half heard, where only on a nameless throne the crownless prince has stirred, where risen from a doubtful seat in half a tainted stall, the last knight of Europe takes weapons from the wall, the last and lingering troubadour, to whom the bird is sung that once went singing southward when all the world was young, and that enormous silence, tiny, unafraid, was up along the winding road, the noise of the crusade. Strong gongs groaning as the guns boom far. Don John of Austria is going to the war. Stiff flags straining in the night blast cold, in the gloom, black purple in the glint old gold, torchlight crimson on the copper kettle drums, then the tuckets, then the trumpets, then the cannon he comes, Don John laughing, and the brave beard curled, spurning of his stirrups like the thrones of all the world, holding his head up as a flag for all the free, love light of Spain, hurrah, death light of Africa, Don John of Austria, light. Hound is in his paradise above the evening star. John of Austria goes to war. He moves his mighty turban on the timeless floor of his knees, his turban that is woven of the sunsets and the seas. He shakes the peacock gardens as he rises from his ease. He strides among the treetops and is taller than the trees. And his voice through all the garden is a thunder sent to bring, like Azrael and Ariel and Ammon on the wing. Giants and the genii, multiplex of wing and eye, whose strong obedience broke the sky when Solomon was king. They rush in red and purple from the red clouds of the morn, from temples where the yellow gods shut up their eyes in scorn. They rise in green robes, roaring from the green hells of the sea, where fallen skies and evil hues and eyeless creatures be. On them the sea valves cluster, and the gray sea forest swirl, splash with a splendid sickness, the sickness of the pearl. They swell in sapphire smoke out of the blue cracks of the ground, and they gather, and they wonder, and give worship to the hound. And he said, break up the mountains where the hermit folk may hide, and shift the red and silver sands, lest bone of saint abide, and chase the jeers flying night and day, not giving rest. For that which was our trouble comes again out of the west. We have set the seal of Solomon on all things under sun, of knowledge and of power and endurance of things done. But a noise is in the mountains, and I know that voice that shook our palaces 500 years ago. It is he that saith not kismet. It is he that knows not fate. It is Richard, it is Raymond, it is Godfrey at the gate. It is he whose loss is laughter when he counts the wager worth. Put down your feet upon him, that our peace be on the earth. For he heard drums droning, and he heard guns jar. Don John of Austria is going to the war, sudden and still. Hurrah! Bolt from Iberia. Don John of Austria has gone by Alcalar. St. Michael's on his mount in the sea roads of the north. Don John of Austria is girt and going forth, where the gray seas glitter and the sharp tides shift, where the sea folk labor and the red sails lift. He shakes his lance of iron. He claps his wings of stone. The noise has gone to Normandy. The noise has gone alone. The north is full of tangled things and texts and aching eyes, and dead is all the innocence of anger and surprise. And Christian killeth Christian in a narrow, dusty room, and Christian dreadeth Christ, who hath a newer face of doom, and Christian hateth Mary, that God kissed in Galilee. But Don John of Austria is riding to the sea. Don John calling through the blast and the eclipse, crying with the trumpet of his lips, trumpet that saith, ha, Domino Gloria. Don John of Austria is shouting to the ships. King Philip's in his closet with the fleece about his neck. Don John of Austria is armed upon the deck. Somebody give me the wall. The walls are hung with velvet that is black and soft as sin. And little dwarves creep out of it. Little dwarves creep in. He holds a crystal phial that has colors like the moon. He touches and it tingles and trembles very soon. And his face is as abundance of a leprous white and gray, like plants in the high houses that are shuttered from the dead. And death is in the phial. And the end of no one. But Don John of Austria has fired upon the Turk. Don John's hunting, and his hounds have bayed. Booms away past Italy the rumor of his raid. Gun upon gun, hurrah! Gun upon gun. Ha ha! Don John of Austria has loosed the cannonade. The Pope was in his chapel before day or battle broke. Don John of Austria is hidden in the smoke. The hidden room in man's house where God sits all the year, the secret window whence the world looks small and very dear. He sees as in a mirror on the monstrous twilight sea, the crescent of his cruel ships, whose name is mystery. They fling great shadows forwards, making cross and castle dark. They veil the plumed lions on the galleys of St. Mark, and above the ships are palaces of brown, black-bearded chiefs. Below the ships are prisons, where with multitudinous griefs, Christian captives, sick and sunless, all a laboring race repines. Like a race in sunken cities, like a nation in the mines, they are lost. Like slaves squat in the skies or mourning. The stairways of the tallest gods where tyranny is come. They are countless, voiceless, hopeless, like those fallen or fleeing on before the high king's horses in the granite of Babylon. And many a one grows witless in his quiet room in hell, where a yellow face looks inward through the lattice of his cell, and he finds his God forgotten, and he seeks no more a sign. But Don John of Austria has burst the battle line, Don John pounding from the slaughter-painted poop, purpling all the ocean like a bloody pirate sloop, crimson running over all the silvers and the golds, breaking the hatches up and bursting the holes, thronging the thousands up who labor under sea, white for bliss and blind for sun, and stunned for liberty. Viva España! Domino Gloria! Don John of Austria has set his people free. Cervantes on his galley sets the sword back in the sheath. Don John of Austria rides home with grief. He sees across a weary land, a winding road in Spain, up which a mean and foolish knight forever rides in vain. And he smiles, but not a sudden smile, and settles back away. Don John of Austria rides